Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean, MEI Chairman Bilahari Kausikan, members of the MEI Management Board, distinguished guests and speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Middle East Institute's 2022 Annual Conference. Much has been written about the geopolitics of the Middle East, whether it is the recalibration of the US military presence or the extending of China's influence through its Belt and Road Initiative. The changing dynamic of regional relationships are obvious and have been reported, analyzed, and continue to be debated. Last year, when we began brainstorming about this year's conference, we asked ourselves what the obvious changes in the Middle East were, domestically and regionally, and whether the dynamic among external players had changed. What impact would these substantial changes in the geopolitical arena have on the Middle East? To us, it was clear that both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were seeking a different economic and social approach that could usher in a modern phase of their societies. Dubai's World Expo, Qatar's hosting of the World Cup, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, and the UAE's participation in the Abraham Accords have all drawn attention to the effort of Gulf countries to effect some kind of transformation. What impact this will have religiously, socially, and culturally remain to be seen. What does all this mean for Asia? Having already considered China's presence and role in the Middle East through its BRI initiative, my colleagues at the Institute were keen to explore the implications of competition between China and India in the Middle East, and whether the region could become a new arena for Asian competition. We hope in the next 2 days to draw out some findings through our three panels that will focus on geopolitics, trade, and what the Abraham Accords could mean for ASEAN. The Institute is also honored to welcome Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean and Minister for Home Affairs and Law, Mr. K. Shanmugam, who will open each day of our conference. It is my very great pleasure now to invite Senior Minister Teo to open our conference. SM Teo has also kindly agreed to participate in a Q&A session after he delivers his speech, which our chairman, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, will moderate. I give the floor now to SM Teo.
I'm pleased to join everyone again for the MEI Annual Conference. I last spoke at this conference 1 year ago, and since then, the geopolitical situation has grown much more complex and volatile. Jostling for influence by the big powers has intensified and become more polarized, with each competing to carve out its own spheres. Even before we could fully digest the implications of the withdrawal of the US and other foreign forces from Afghanistan, a new crisis erupted in Ukraine. These seemingly unrelated conflicts in different parts of the world are not unlinked. The contesting powers are circling each other warily, watching each other's moves, getting the measure of the power, influence, and resolve of the other parties, and shaping their actions accordingly. In Europe, the war in Ukraine has rocked the uneasy order that has been in place since the end of the Cold War. Instead of the quick victory that many predicted when Russian troops invaded on February the 24th, the situation has now turned more dangerous. As Russia persists with its aims and the US and its allies continue to provide weapons to Ukraine, fears of a wider war have grown. What the situation will look like when the dust settles, which may take some time, is anybody's guess. The new US administration has been in office for nearly a year and a half. Its arrival signaled a change of approach to the Middle East, not least in reviving talks with Iran. The withdrawal from Afghanistan sent shockwaves through the region. Although the US had signaled its intention to withdraw since the Obama administration and had been drawing down troop levels, regional allies and global competitors alike did not seem to believe that the US would or could really leave. They were left flat-footed and scrambling to adjust when President Biden decisively cut the Gordian knot. The withdrawal operation an unexpectedly rapid collapse of the then Afghan security forces and government left the Taliban to rapidly come into power. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, paradoxically, thus also served to underscore the key role that the US plays in the regional balance. These shifting currents come as the debate continues over the US's role in the region. The US's focus on the Indo-Pacific strategy, and now its added preoccupation with Russia, will take up much of the US's bandwidth. Some have wondered whether the reordering of Washington's priorities in the Middle East signals a retreat from the Middle East. However, the US Navy's continued presence in Bahrain, the US Air Force's Al Udeid base in Qatar, and the recent engagement of incoming missiles by Patriot batteries and F-22 deployment to the UAE in response to Houthi attacks suggest otherwise. It was not so much a retreat as a recalibration of the terms of engagement to de-emphasize the role of ground forces. Energy has also once again become weaponized, as it was in the 1970s. The Middle East remains a key player in energy geopolitics. The Gulf exporters have not been in a rush to respond to American calls to turn on their oil spigots to moderate prices in the wake of the Ukraine war. The repercussions are being felt even here in Singapore. Spiking energy prices have forced companies to shut down and hit consumers and households. Within the region itself, countries are seeking a reset in ties. The Turkish president was recently in Saudi Arabia as part of a bid to turn the page on a rocky relationship. The US and the West are engaging in back channels with Iran and promising to lift sanctions, not just because of nuclear proliferation concerns, but in the hope of enticing Iran out of Russia's orbit. The Abraham Accords has spurred a flurry of groundbreaking activity. One took place barely a month ago, a summit in the Negev in Israel, attended by 4 Arab foreign ministers. Quiet discussions are taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran, facilitated by Oman. Although it is premature to conclude that long-standing historical and sectarian suspicions can be raised and these adjustments will hold over the long run, this would have been unthinkable just 3 years ago. These changes in the external environment have resulted in equally profound internal recalculations. They have recognized that internal adjustment is a necessary condition of successful adaptation to changes in their external environment. Many Middle Eastern countries are looking at their domestic policies, re-looking at them, including their social contracts with citizens. These countries have ambitious transformation plans to diversify their economies and create new jobs. The shifts are also necessitated by reducing over-reliance on hydrocarbons as the global call for climate change and sustainability grows. At the same time, there will be a continuing need for subsidies to maintain social stability in the face of rising inflation, especially in food prices. New sources of state revenue will therefore have to be found. Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have already introduced a value-added tax. And after a lengthy review, Oman is considering introducing personal income tax next year, although there remains no official confirmation. In order to prepare for the future economy, Middle Eastern countries have realized that change at the social and religious level is also needed. For instance, the UAE has embarked on a major drive to position itself as an oasis of tolerance. In 2019, Pope Francis held a papal mass in Abu Dhabi, which was attended by around 135,000 people. And during this visit, Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Ahmad Al-Taib, signed a document on human fraternity, which called for unity and goodwill among all peoples and faiths, while rejecting extremism of any kind. The reopening of a synagogue in Manama, Bahrain, and the Dubai Chala Bake, which drew much attention last month, are also signs of the times. The Jewish community in the Gulf are not just practicing its traditions openly, but growing as well. In Asia, home to most of the world's Muslims, these transformative shifts are being studied closely, both in Muslim-majority countries as well as in countries where Muslims are a significant minority. The Abraham Accords have an important economic motivation, with the Arab countries benefiting from Israeli technology and Israel benefiting from Arab investments and export markets. But closer readings of the communiques that emerged from the Negev summit point to a future in which the Accords will become an instrument of geopolitical competition within and beyond the region. In that respect, the question of Palestine will continue to be salient. Until it is resolved, the issue remains ripe for being seized upon by various parties and forcing itself back onto the international stage. The issue continues to have deep resonance and support among Muslims in Southeast Asia. Singapore has taken a principled stand on the Palestinian issue, as we have done with Ukraine, to seek a peaceful and negotiated solution. There are also new strategic players in the geopolitical competition in the Middle East. China's Belt and Road Initiative has seen it enter into many top-level partnerships with Gulf countries and with Iran. India has begun to look west again to its near abroad in the Middle East, with its large diaspora in the Gulf. Both China and India, as have many other countries in Europe, recognize the importance of engaging the Middle East to secure energy supplies in the face of uncertainties over Russian supplies. As the Asian giants compete in the Middle East, particularly with the recent flare-up in China-India border disputes, the potential for friction in the Middle East between the two Asian powers has grown. Against this increasingly complex backdrop, what can Asia and the Middle East do together? I would like to highlight three important areas. First, instead of choosing a side, regardless of issue or context, we should signal that we take principled positions to uphold a rules-based, inclusive, open, and connected global order that is based on international law, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. Deciding our positions based on clear and consistent principles will make us reliable and steadfast partners. Second, smaller countries can come together to help shape the global order. For example, by upholding and updating the global security architecture and trading system, even if the major powers are unable to reach an agreement. For example, Singapore was the first country from outside the region to sign a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which came into force in 2013. There is potential to participate in various initiatives across the Middle East, such as Smart Dubai, Saudi Vision 2030, Digital Egypt, and Morocco's new model of development. Middle Eastern countries can also find many opportunities for investment and partnership in Asia, especially in growth areas such as green energy, sustainable economy, technology, and infrastructure development. Third, both regions can work together to strengthen mutual understanding and people-to-people exchanges. As the birthplace of Islam, how the Middle East understands the religion and Islam's relationships with other faiths will shape the practice of Islam all over the world, including in Asia. We should work together to promote a better understanding of Islam, in particular its fundamental beliefs and values around the world. Countries in Asia, be it China, Japan, Korea, or those in Southeast Asia, have had a long relationship with the Middle East. We should exchange experiences and knowledge about each other's development journeys and governance, as we foster closer ties between Asia and the Middle East. Whether it is between Asia and the Middle East, between the superpowers, or with the rest of the world, we need more constructive interactions to enhance mutual understanding. This will form the basis for countries to work together for enlightened self-interest for the benefit of all, rather than narrow self-interest. I was therefore glad to visit the Dubai World Expo this January, the first World Expo hosted in the Middle East. It was fascinating to see so many countries around the world represented and the exchange of ideas on important global issues. Ultimately, the more we work together and share in one another's success and prosperity, the lower the likelihood of conflict and the brighter our collective future can be. I wish everyone a fruitful conference. Thank you.
Let me kick it off. There are many people in the audience with questions, but I'll take the privilege of a moderator to ask the first few questions at least. You know, you had mentioned in your speech that as India and China get more engaged in the Middle East, there is a potential for frictions in the Himalayas, for example, to spill over. Do you see any prospect of that further spilling over eastwards rather than westwards into our own region?
Well, I would say that China does have interests in the Indian Ocean basin, in the Middle East, in Africa, because of its energy requirements, its trade, investments. And India also has been a long historical partner of our part of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, where its influence has been felt for centuries. And it has this combination of both India's and China's influence in our part of the world has been positive historically. It's brought civilizational benefits to our part of the world, and in Southeast Asia you can see influences of both. And this continues into the present, and we hope will be constructive for the future as well. So we welcome India's presence in our part of the world. But when I look at India, I see that its major preoccupations are actually domestic. That's a major driver, as with many countries in the world, perhaps slightly more in India. And its major concerns and security are with its immediate surroundings, in the Himalayas, in the Indian Ocean Rim. And I see that China has projected itself into this region for its own imperatives, basically trade, investment, energy, and also its concerns about its trade routes. And therefore, it is developing overland routes through Myanmar and Pakistan to reach the Indian Ocean, to try and secure its routes. And this, of course, has caused sensitivities to India. But in our part of the world, I see India being more present, wanting to play a bigger role, and I hope that it will do so in a constructive way, and I hope that both countries will be able to find a way of resolving their differences. I think they're not irresolvable. I mean, historically, they have long ties.
Well, thank you. That's a very optimistic note to start with, and I guess we have to be optimistic. One of the most fascinating parts of your initial presentation was the nexus you drew between, implicitly but clearly enough, between adaptation as the Middle East adapts to geopolitical changes. This requires them to adapt internally, economically, and economic adaptation also requires social, cultural, religious adaptation. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things about the Middle East, which we all should watch closely in the years ahead. Now, what lessons, and as you mentioned, of course, the Middle East is the source of Islam for everybody. So what lessons do you think Muslim communities in Singapore, in Southeast Asia generally, should take from these rather profound transformations that are underway?
Well, I think Muslim societies, just like all other societies in the world, are trying to find a response to the challenges of the new world. Technology, changes, globalization, many of these things. And they are causing stresses and shocks to each of our societies. And in the Muslim world, there are profound changes taking place. There's one stream of response to this which harks back to the past, to a more literal interpretation of Islam as a sort of shelter from the challenges of the modern world. But I think there's a stronger stream which is encouraging sort of a more inclusive and open adaptation to the modern world. And this requires economic transformation, social transformation to go hand in hand. And one of the other drivers that's taking place is that many of the economies in the Middle East have historically been dependent on hydrocarbons. And this is changing now. And we need to find new ways in which to leverage on the hydrocarbon resources and the expertise and the wealth and knowledge capital that's been built up over the years to pivot to an economy which has a new basis, and to develop the human capital, the enormous human capital that's available in the Middle Eastern countries, to look ahead into the new world. So for Southeast Asian countries, we look at these developments as positive. Islam in Southeast Asia is more syncretic in nature and came to Southeast Asia not by conquest, but through trade, through cultural exchange. And whether we are a Muslim majority country in Southeast Asia or a country with significant Muslim minorities, what we look to is an Islam which is comfortable with itself, more adapted to the modern world, open, inclusive, and where religions, all religions, have mutual respect for each other. And this is what we hope to see, and the lessons which we hope to learn from developments taking place now in the Middle East.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I've abused the position of moderator and monopolized you with my questions. So we have got some questions coming in from the audience. So please, let me take the first question, right? This is a fairly specific question, but I think an important one. The US is embarking on an, quotes, over-the-horizon counterterrorism policy, rather than getting involved in the trenches in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. What do you see as the material impacts of this over-the-horizon policy, particularly for the Middle East, South Asia, and maybe Southeast Asia too?
Well, I think that if you take Afghanistan as an example, the US went into Afghanistan with a specific purpose, and that was to remove the ability of Al-Qaeda, which was operating there, to form groups which threatened not only the US, but countries all over the world, including countries in Southeast Asia like Singapore, where we had people who became radicalized, trained in Afghanistan, and came back to pose direct threats to us. So I think the US achieved that goal quite quickly and efficiently. I think where they set themselves a much more difficult stretch target was to try and change the nature of Afghan society, which I think is much more complex and has involved them for many more years.
Good luck to them.
Yes. So that was really not so much a counter-terrorism kind of approach, but really trying to change the nature of the society, which is much more difficult. So I think that all countries, including the US, have learned some lessons from this. President Biden has decided to leave and take an offshore strategy. So I think if we focus on trying to deal with terrorism as it arises, trying to encourage countries to develop themselves in a way which sort of benefits their people and doesn't sort of incentivize them towards terrorism, then I think we have more chances of succeeding. And it also means that a country like the US has more bandwidth to deal with a wider range of issues rather than getting mired in particular spots.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from the audience. happen to know this person is a civil servant, but I shall not mention the name. But it's a good question. Will the Gulf prove to be a refuge of sort for Indians from India, I would think, as communal tensions mount? Can Gulf states tap at this important source of talent and the process also compete with Singapore for global talent? I think that's a very good question, because I think the Gulf, Dubai in particular, has taken a new approach towards attracting talent, which is, I think, a serious challenge.
Yes. Well, the Indian diaspora is a formidable one. Very talented, able people, and it's not just in the Gulf, but elsewhere. The diaspora in the US and in Europe have taken up important positions in the political arena, in business, in finance, in science, in medicine. And so the Indian diaspora is a formidable one. So the fact that the Middle East may be another location where the Indian diaspora may find themselves comfortable is not going to be something that changes the overall dynamic for the Indian diaspora. For our part of the world, I think that we need to find a way to remain open to people from all countries in order to tap on their knowledge, talent, links, in order to be able to help to catalyze and advance our own development. And I think that ability to remain open must be there. And for us in Singapore, we do intend to remain open. But we want to remain open in a way in which we derive the maximum benefits from this, and we are able to manage also some of the frictions that will take place in society as a result of competition and other kinds of things. But be assured that on the Singapore end, we will remain open. It's part of our DNA.
We have no choice anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. Another question from the audience, from somebody that you and I know very well, Zainul Abidin.
Yes.
All right.
I just met Zainul the other day.
Okay. Zainul asks, given the changing geopolitical changes in the Middle East, can you see a role for our Malay Muslims as representatives of the First World? I'm not sure we consider ourselves representative of the First World, but that's the question, and I guess I know what is behind it.
Yes. Well, I think that the way that, as I mentioned just now, the way that Islam is practiced in our part of the world, not just in Singapore. I mean, we are a small Muslim community, but the way that Islam is practiced in our part of the world is relatively syncretic because of the way that Islam came. And if you look at, say, Indonesia, they have their concepts of Islam Nusantara and so on. I think that if we can develop a model for Islam, which is comfortable with itself and comfortable in the modern world, that will be a boon for everyone. We have looked very carefully at how we are doing our Islamic education system in Singapore. So we have our madrasas, our Islamic religious schools, but which have taken on a modern form. So our Islamic religious schools now, for example, are offering the International Baccalaureate as one of the tracks for graduating high school students.
Yes, I noticed that.
Yes, and they will still be able to have sufficient religious knowledge, knowledge in Arabic, in order to qualify for Al-Azhar, for example. So this actually puts them at the very useful junction between Islam and the modern world. And we hope that through these kinds of developments, we will be able to have Islam that is comfortable with itself, comfortable with the modern world, and contextualized to each country's needs and requirements. And in that sense, I hope that we can play a role.
I see no reason why Singapore Malay Muslims cannot qualify for both Al-Azhar and Harvard,
Yes,
for example.
exactly.
Right. Well, I have another question. This one is from one of our researchers, Alex Aduno. I think you met him briefly just now.
Mm-hmm.
He spent 20 over years in China. And his question is about China. You had drawn attention to seemingly disparate conflicts in the connections between seemingly disparate conflicts in Ukraine and Afghanistan and so on. And his question is this: the Ukrainian crisis has extracted a material toll on China, high costs on energy imports, for example. And Beijing's dynamic zero-COVID policy is a double whammy, and the growth outlook for the world's #2 economy is uncertain now, at least in the immediate future. What can you say about the outlook for Asia, particularly Singapore, as a result, and also for the future of the BRI? We have not heard too much of the BRI in the last couple of years. He has a second part to the question, but I will leave that for later.
Well, I think we have to dissociate many of these things. I mean, the pandemic has caused severe disruptions to every country in the world, and also to China. But I think we should be careful not to second guess what China is doing in managing its own pandemic, how it balances lives and livelihoods. They will understand best for themselves what their vaccination rates are, their vaccine efficiency, efficacy, the vaccination rates of their older folks and so forth, and what might happen in the country if they have a rapid opening up. And they have seen what's happened in other countries which have not applied social distancing measures and so on to control the spread at a time when, in an appropriate way. And they've had a devastating effect on lives, not just from people who succumb to the illness, but people who might have survived the illness, but succumbed because the health system was overwhelmed and couldn't help them to recover when they could. So I think China is looking at all these things and will make its own judgments about how fast it wants to open and when. And this one, I think, is just a matter of time. So this is, I would say, is a transient effect, even though there will be a lot of frustration and angst at the moment. But what's happened in Russia, I think, with Russia and Ukraine, has got a much longer term and profound effect. And I think all countries are watching each other. I have no doubt that the withdrawal from Afghanistan has had an effect on the calculations of Russia on whether to take action or not in Ukraine. And what happens in Ukraine will have an effect on the calculations of all parties in our part of the world and in the Middle East.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you are right that the Ukraine conflict is going to be a very long, drawn-out affair.
Yes.
And all of us, not just China or Russia, are going to feel its effect in one way or the other. Well, there is another question from somebody else we both know, I think, Fazlul.
Yes, Fazlul.
And his question is about the Abraham Accords.
Yes.
And will the Abraham Accords change attitudes in this part of the world regarding the Palestinian issue? Just this year, for example, we announced the opening of an embassy in Israel. That's a far cry of what happened, and there was no response, actually, in our region. And that's a far cry from what happened, when the elder Herzog visited some decades ago.
Well, first of all, Singapore's position on the Palestinian issue, we have always taken a principled position. We respect all the UN Security Council resolutions, we support them, and we support a negotiated two-state solution. While we have opened an embassy in Tel Aviv, we have also opened a representative office in Ramallah. So we take a balanced and principled approach to this issue. And we do believe that in all the other developments in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords and so on, ultimately, we do need to find a fair, just, negotiated settlement for the Palestinian issue. And I think that for Muslims in our part of the world, this remains a very salient issue because it has to do with justice and fairness and to hope for a good outcome for people in that part of the world?
Well, I think I can ask one more of my questions
Sure.
since I restrained myself and asked other people's questions. You know, one of the things, it follows on the question about the Abraham Accord. Of course, the Abraham Accord was fundamentally driven by geopolitical and political considerations. But there is an economic aspect, because I think the Gulf countries, UAE in particular, has understood that as they transform their economies, Israel, with its very creative economy, can play a very major role. Do you see a similar place for economic opportunities for us in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, as the Gulf countries recalibrate their economies?
Oh, yes, certainly. And that's the reason why Singapore is the first country from outside the region to have a free trade agreement with the GCC.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something quite remarkable. We look ahead and we said, let's engage more fundamentally. And it's a two-way engagement. We see ourselves engaging with GCC for investment and trade into the GCC, and also the GCC countries using Singapore as a gateway to our part of the world, for which there are many opportunities. And I see many, many new opportunities for engagement. And one of them really has to do with energy. The pivot away from a hydrocarbon-based world economy to one in which climate action and green energy or low carbon energy becomes more important is quite critical. And I was in the UAE recently. I visited Abu Dhabi. I spoke to ADNOC and others, and they are all very keen on seeing how to pivot, say, away from hydrocarbon-based economy to one in which you can export low-carbon fuels, for example, blue hydrogen and other forms of fuels. And so I think that in this part of the world, there will be a great demand for that. There will be a great demand for that. There will be markets for that. And if you just take Singapore alone, we are a major center for shipping and airlines. And so a lot of ships and aircraft actually refuel here in Singapore, take fuel in Singapore. And we would be interested, for example, in working with countries in the Middle East to create a center for refueling in this part of the world, and with green fuels to promote a better climate for the world.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question.
Sure.
50 years ago, about half a century ago, the US corrected its mistake in Vietnam and moved from direct intervention on the ground to playing the role as offshore balancer. And it's been pretty consistent in that role. Of course, there have been variations from administration to administration, but pretty consistent. And we, in this part of the world, have got used to dealing with the US as offshore balancer. Now, recently, much more recently, last year, the US corrected a mistake it made in Afghanistan, and it shifted to what I consider an analogous role as offshore balancer, de-emphasizing, as you mentioned, ground forces, but keeping its naval forces, its air forces, in the broader region. But this is a much less familiar role for the Middle East, especially for the Gulf states. What lessons do you think the Gulf, as they adapt to this new reality, can take from our experience in Southeast Asia of dealing with the US? The US is a constant reality. Nobody, whether you consider it reliable, unreliable, you like it or you don't like it, it's a reality that you have to deal with. What lessons can they take from our experience of dealing with the US as offshore balancer, if there are any?
Well, I would say that the US is, structurally or inherently a maritime power. Yeah. And it's, in the long term, a maritime power tends to adopt this kind of offshore strategy in the long term, even though it may get involved in land wars or land interventions from time to time. But ultimately, its strategic stance will tend to be one of an offshore power and projecting its power using naval and air forces. And I would say that that's different from a continental power. So in our part of the world, since the US has moved out of Vietnam, and also not to forget that they closed their bases in Clark and Subic. And
Mother Nature has something to do with that.
Mother Nature had something to do with that in Clark. But the US has begun to look for what they call places, not bases, to have a much more flexible footprint. And so that's what they're doing. But what does it mean for countries in our region? What it means for countries in our region is that each of us really has to be more self-reliant. We have to build up our own strengths, our own security capabilities, and we can't just depend on others. And that's individual countries, and collectively we also need to build up our security capabilities to deal with issues in our region. And then we can then work together with countries from outside the region, including the US, to help maintain security. But essentially, one of the key prerequisites is to develop our own country's resilience and regional resilience. And I think that's to the good, so that the countries in our regions will begin to take more responsibility for their own security and their own security architecture. So it's not just whether you buy weapons or build up your armed forces, but it's also thinking about what your security entails. What I spoke about principles, what are the principles involved, what do you advocate for, what do you push for, and how do you order yourself in order to achieve those objectives. And I think that in itself is a good process because it gives the countries and the region more agency. And countries which are smaller can have agency and can influence developments.
Well, I think there was an old Indonesian slogan about ASEAN which is also applicable to the Middle East. National resilience creates regional resilience, and regional resilience creates national resilience. Well, we have run out of time, SM. Thank you. You have been very generous with your time with us. Thank you to the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions that you have put in, but please continue tuning in to our online webinar, and I hope you have found this session interesting. Thank you again, SM.
Thank you, Bilal. And thank you for all your very sharp questions. Thank you.